Hello, and welcome to the contributed session T on text data in macro measurement. My name is Eva Arnold. I will be the chair of this session. Our first presenter is To from the University of Reading, followed then by Yu Cheng from the Princeton University, and then finally from myself. So let's begin. We will have 20 minutes for each presentation and then 10 minutes for a Q&A session. And then we can use the breakout sessions afterwards to have a more informal discussion. So, To, would you like to start?
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen and hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, thank you very much for having our paper on this program. So today I'm going to talk about the knowledge graph for macroeconomic analysis with alternative big data. So this is joint work with Yue Pang from Peking University, Guan Hua from USTC, and Wei Nanyi from Princeton. So as a macroeconomist, we know that traditional macroeconomic models, no matter it's DSG models or structural VR models, we mostly can only handle a small number of variables. But recently, with the rise of big data and machine learning, now we are able to develop macroeconomic models with many more variables, especially those alternative new variables. So which you can see many examples in this conference. So in our mind, there are two approaches to use big data to study macro. So one approach, what we call as kind of statistical approach, is to put many variables into the statistical models directly. So think about those papers on dynamic vector models or recent papers on like random forest or other machine learning methods that study high dimensional inputs to predict, or analyze inflation output and so on. So the other approach is kind of to find a new data source, especially alternative data source, and to study one or few alternative variables in a time. So think about those papers that use satellite image, use cell phone data, or those economic tracker projecting the COVID, which people want to use some new data source to track some aspect of the economy using big data. So both approaches has been very successful and has been very influential in both academic research and also policy making. But we argue that so both approaches also have their limitation. So for example, for the statistical approach, so it's kind of that people want to put many variables into statistical model directly, but without really understanding the relationship among those variables. And for the second approach, people can only study very few variables in a time, so but cannot systematically study many variables in a coherent framework. So we think that we need a knowledge system on the relations among traditional variables and many new economic variables to design model inputs more systematically to study big data. And this paper is an attempt toward this end. So in this paper, we want to build a knowledge graph of the relations among traditional and alternative variable data variables. So what is knowledge graph? Knowledge graph is essentially it's one of the most popular notion in the age of artificial intelligence. It is essentially a knowledge base that uses graph topology to represent interlinked descriptions of entities. So the basic elements of the knowledge graph is this so-called RDF triple with a form of subject, predicate, and object. So look at this following example of knowledge graph on Albert Einstein. As you can see, in this part of knowledge graph, the subject will be the theory of relativity, the predicate will be proposed by, and the object will be Albert Einstein. So this kind of knowledge graph has many important applications in real world. So one of the most prominent application is Google search. So essentially, Google is using this kind of knowledge graph to power its search algorithm like PageRank. So similarly, we hope to build a knowledge graph of the linkages between traditional economic variables and alternative variables. So like Google want to use this kind of knowledge graph to power its search engine. So we hope to use knowledge graph to power macroeconomic research with alternative big data. So the question now is how we are going to extract those RDF triples that document the relations among economic variables. So we are going to extract those relations and variables from academic literature and the industry research reports, which have already covered, many of those potential relations anecdotally. So, and as an application here, in this paper, we will apply this knowledge graph of economic variables to do variable selection in economic forecasting. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the literature part in detail, but here we are going to contribute to the literature on big data and machine learning macroeconomics, like many papers in this great conference. And we are also contribute to the knowledge graph of scientific discovery. So if there's no question on the motivation, I'm going to introduce the data that we are going to use for knowledge graph construction. As I said, we are going to extract those RDF triples from academic research or industry research reports. So here, the data we are going to use in this paper is the industry macro research reports from China. So there are three main advantages of this data set. The first one is that, so those industry reports, so they mostly focus on analyze or forecasting the dynamics of some aggregate variables. So it is always clearly stated that which variable they are studying in each of those reports. So the second advantage is that they mostly adopt the so-called narrative approach, which is when they study, for example, inflation, they are going to clearly state the logic chains of their analysis in narrative language. So rather than in theoretical or quantitative models we commonly see in academic research. So the last but not least advantage of this data, textual data, is that it's freely available and it can be downloaded massively from some database. So before presenting the detailed algorithm of construction of knowledge graph, so let me start with an example to tell you guys how we can really extract those RDF triples, those relations among variables, from the one paragraph of industry reports. So this paragraph comes from industry reports on study China's inflation dynamics. So the author of the report say that a long-term systematic migration worker shortage began to appear in this migration worker labor market, and which greatly increased the growth rate of migration worker wages, which result in the increase of food price and push up the increase in consumer price index and make the average level of inflation some point higher. So as you can see, I have already highlighted what are the variables, no matter it's conventional variable or alternative variables, that we can extract from this paragraph, which include migration worker shortage, also include the growth rate of migration worker wages, and also food price, and also CPI and inflation. So I have also highlighted the relation keywords among those variables we can extract. So from this example paragraph, we can extract the following RDF triples with the format of variable 1 relation variable 2, which is we can extract migration worker shortage will increase the growth rate of migration worker wages, and the growth rate of migration worker wages will increase the food price, and the food price will push up CPI, and food price will also make inflation higher. So as you may also already see that the last two of these four RDF triples are actually the same thing. So after removing these duplicates, we can get a very small part of the final knowledge graph centered at inflation. So which clearly state the logic chain among migration worker shortage and urban wage and then how urban wage is going to affect food price, and how food price is going to affect the inflation rate. So with this example in mind, so now let me present the general algorithm that we can use to construct knowledge graph centered at aggregate variables of our interest. So in the first step, so we are going to make a list of aggregate variables of interest together with their variance. So for example, we just say inflation is something we want to know. We want to study, as aggregate variable. So inflation has another name of CPI. And also we can also have, GDP, output, investment, and so on as aggregate variables of interest. Then we will find all these aggregate variable and their variance in the document with string match. Then, so we will start around these aggregate variables detected in the documents and find all the other variables around it, as well as the relation among aggregate variables and other variables. So I will talk a bit more about this step because this is actually the most challenging step in this paper later. So then after extract the variables and the relations, we can represent them in RDF triple structures. After dropping the duplicates, we can build up the knowledge graph. So the main challenge in this process is essentially, how to detect variable names and the relation among variables in a textual data. So this falls into the so-called named entity recognition in the natural language processing literature. So here the challenge is essentially the challenge for named entity recognition for economic variables. It is very hard because economic variables is always, multi-token entities with very complicated semantic patterns. So for example, we have seen variable names like migration worker shortage. By variable, I mean something that we can really measure. We also see some other variables like, leverage rate of local government financed vehicles, which is even more complicated. So to effectively extract all these variables and their relations among those variables, we'll develop an active learning algorithm with human involvement. So what is active learning? Active learning is a machine learning algorithm. When labeling is very expensive, so we need an algorithm to decide which data we want the human editors to label. And then after the human editors do their work, the model can really effectively to learn from. So the active learning algorithm to extract variable names from textual data goes as follows. So first, we are going to have an initial set of economic variables. So think that you can easily download a very long list of economic variable names from some database. And then also an initial data set of relation keywords like increase, decrease, neutral, something like that. So after you have this initial set, so you can use a current set of variables to train a language model to predict whether a phrase is a variable. So a phrase is like an n-gram entity from the textual data. So then we will find the sentences that contain many potential variables but very few relation keywords. Then we will ask the human editor to go to those sentences to find more relation keywords for us to expand the set of relation keywords. Then similarly, we'll find sentences that containing relation keywords but very few variables. So we'll ask the human editors to go to those sentences to find the variables in those sentences, so we can expand the variable set by retraining the language model in step 2. So after repeating steps 3 and 4 until convergence, we'll get a very large list of economic variables and their relations from that we can really extract from the textual data. So after all this procedure, we can get many knowledge graphs centered at different aggregate variables of interest. So here is a part of the knowledge graph centered at inflation rate. So as you can see, so in this knowledge graph, we have extract some conventional relations that we know that that is going to affect inflation. For example, money supply. So it's going to affect inflation. For example, the baseline interest rate is also going to affect inflation. But we also successfully extract many alternative variables and alternative relations that's going to affect the inflation. So we have already seen how this, urban migration worker shortage may affect inflation. So there will also be, something like crude oil import, which may also, affect the inflation rate. So which kind of, we systematically extract all these, relations that people have been formally or informally document in their research reports. So as you can see, so also for all these, ages in this knowledge graph, so we can see that we classify all the relation into 3 classes. So one is increase, the other is decrease, and also, kind of a neutral relation, which we call as relate. And as we can see, the linkages on this knowledge graph can be 1 layer or even multiple layers. And also, because all the textual data we use comes with some, timestamps, so we can actually construct some time-varying, version of knowledge graphs to see how, people's analysis on inflation has been changing over time. So, for example, maybe before 2000, people's analysis on inflation has been, mostly using money supply. But after, kind of some time, people are using more and more some interest rate or some other alternative measures to study inflation, which is kind of very interesting to us. So, so this is just an example of knowledge graph centered at inflation. So you can see more examples of knowledge graph centered at, investment, housing price, GDP, and so on in our paper. So as a new knowledge system, there will be many potential applications. So here in this paper, we are going to apply this knowledge graph in a concrete exercise, which is do economic forecasting with many inputs. So here in this paper, we will. Okay.
Yujing, sorry to interrupt. You've got 5 minutes.
Sure. So here in this paper, we are going to use China's monthly inflation and nominal investment time series for this around 25-year period. So for each horizon ahead, from 1 month to 12 months ahead, so we hope to forecast the aggregate variables with input variables in the past 3 months. So as a comparison, so we are first going to construct a baseline model. So in a baseline model, when people want to forecast like inflation, what they're going to do is to find some standard time series data. So here we use the standard time series data constructed by Higgins and Zhao from Atlanta Fed as model inputs. And because this standard time series is also a high dimensional input, so we are going to use some statistical method like Lasso to do some model reduction work to do the baseline forecasting. And as a comparison, in the knowledge graph-based model, so we are going to model the design of model inputs guided by our knowledge graph centered at inflation and investment. So here we are going to try our best to collect as many variables as possible following the guidance of the knowledge graph. And then, because it's also a very high dimensional input, so we are also going to use some statistical method over that. So here we do a lot of robustness check. We try different lags. We replace the Lasso method with some other statistical method, and the results seem to be quite robust. So this page is going to give you a sense of what are the variables we include in the baseline model and in the knowledge graph-based model. So as you can see, so for example, this is for inflation forecasting. So here we collect as many variables as possible in the, following the knowledge graph centered as inflation. So as you can see from this list, so this list includes many standard time series, but also include many, alternative data. So this is the comparison results for the test error in out of sample test set for this forecasting exercise. So from 1 month to 12 months ahead, so as you can see, in short-term forecasting, so the baseline model with standard time series data as input perform almost as well as the knowledge graph based model in a short run. But when the forecasting horizon get larger, the baseline model for this blue line is getting worse and worse. But the knowledge graph model, the forecasting performance in the test set seems to be quite stable, and the forecasting error is quite low. And so this is a short run and long run comparison, and all these long run comparisons and also some of the short run comparisons are significant under the Diebold-Maranello test. And also we want to understand why this knowledge graph based model can dominate this baseline model in the long run. So we actually find that the baseline model do their forecasting entirely based on the lag CPI and GDP deflator, while the knowledge graph based model it not only use lag CPI information, but also use some alternative data information like commodity output. So another advantage of this knowledge graph based model is it has some guaranteed interpretation, because all the variables in the knowledge graph based model comes from some economic logic narratives, which guarantees that the final model you get can easily be interpreted. And so when I present this paper with some industry audience, so they told me that, so there is a saying in the industry saying that short-term forecasts mainly rely on statistics, while long-term forecasts would rely on logic. So it seems to us that the knowledge graph can better capture the underlying logic of the economy than statistical model on big data. Okay, to conclude, so in this project, we introduce the concept of knowledge graph to study macroeconomics with big data more systematically. So we developed an active learning NLP algorithm to build knowledge graphs of relations among traditional and alternative variables from textual data. So as a kind of new knowledge system, there will be many exciting applications ahead. So in this paper, we explore the application of variable selection in economic forecasting. So this paper is actually an important part of our broad agenda on macroeconomic research in the age of big data and machine learning. And beyond this work, so we are going to have a pipeline of work, including, so here we will try to do something more systematic for active learning to extract economic variables from textual data, including these reports. And also we are working on academic papers like MBE working paper to see how people's analysis of macroeconomic variables has been evolving over time. So this paper is about the knowledge graph of kind of variable system. So we are also going to explore the knowledge graph of objective functions, policy objectives. Also with this variable system and the objective system in hand, so we are trying to thinking about do macroeconomic research in this high dimensional environment, and we are doing something kind of more structural flavor. So we just started presenting this new paper on using deep learning to solve for high dimensional structural models like heterogeneous agent models we commonly see in macroeconomics. So we believe that this is a very exciting research agenda, and we look forward to see more work done in this direction. Okay, so this is my presentation, and this is a link to the paper. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eugene. Very, very interesting and exciting topic. What I didn't really get from the slides are the variables you use that you collect from the RDF triple. So for your forecasting exercise, so you collect the data first, and then you extract the information on the content and relation between economic variables, right? And then you use then this like the same statistical data and put them into the model, but in a different relation to each other, or did I get it wrong?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So here, so we are going to, so the construction of knowledge graph comes from the textual data. So which is kind of, we think about how many people, how the a collection of experts are studying, for example, inflation, in many years, how people are really do that. And then when we want to forecast, inflation. So usually if we want to forecast inflation using the US data, so people usually, just take the, the Fred MD or Fred QD type of data set from the shelf and use some machine learning methods. So we think that it's not very systematic because we don't really understand, what are in the, Fred MD or Fred QD when we use them to forecast inflation. So here we do something very different. So we first construct a knowledge graph for inflation, and then we collect, the variables, economic variables on those, on those variable around inflation in the knowledge graph. So which kind of we design the model input following the guidance of this knowledge graph of inflation.
Right. Thank you. But you do not collect, you do not keep collecting textual data for your forecasting exercise. Just to train the model, right?
No. So the textual data have the textual data is only for constructing the knowledge graph. So so after you have the knowledge graph, you know how to design a model input for the forecasting exercise.
I get it.
So we no longer want to directly use some Fred MD or Fred QD to do inflation forecast. Rather, we want to use human wisdom in the past many years to design model inputs for inflation forecasting.
I see. Thank you very much. Really, really exciting work. Thanks a lot. Are there any more questions and then write a comment in the FNA. No further questions. All right. Right. Then, To, if you would like to take it from here, then if there are no further questions, then you could move on. Thank you very much. Is the paper somewhere available?
Oh, yes. So the paper is available on both SSR and arXiv.
All right. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Zhu Chen. And I guess now it's Eva's turn to present her work. So I will take over Eva's role as the chair. Eva, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I will share my screen. Sorry, do you see the slides?
Not yet.
No. Sorry. All right. You see them now?
Yes, now we see it.
All right. All right. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to present this work, which is on banks through the lens of the media. Well, why do we look into news on banks? This is, well, there are lots of studies on topics in the media and also sentiment in the media, and studies of risk perception have shown that most lay people have a comprehensive idea of risks, and Slovak has also shown that media has a great significance for informing and educating the general public about risks. Especially in times of financial crisis, information on banks is crucial in preventing undesirable events like bank runs. In this respect, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision considers the media as a secondary source of information in order to replace credible information disclosed by banks. The Basel Committee additionally acknowledges that even if banks disclose their condition publicly, depositors are not able to monitor banks effectively due to a lack of training. So our main research questions are: how understandable is information about banks in the daily press? Which banks and bank types are actually covered? How does the media evaluate banks and bank types? And do we find systematic differences between local and national outlets? When choosing appropriate news sources, we took into consideration recent studies showing that 65% of the German population trusts in news coverage in general, and in particular in regional press, but also in national newspapers. Moreover, Kearney and Leo emphasized that a wide selection of news sources should be used rather than a small number of newspapers in order to ensure to get an unbiased representation of information in the news. Hence, we choose both national and regional daily newspapers for our analysis. In particular, we collect a really comprehensive selection of articles in daily newspapers, including 6 national and 51 regional newspapers using the database LexisNexis, and then the national newspapers Handelsblatt and Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. We search for the word or word part bank or Sparkasse, which is a savings bank. And by using this criteria, we capture all individual bank names, bank types, as well as additional institutions like the Bundesbank or ECB and the banking supervising authorities. So after cleaning the data, our search yields almost 500,000 articles. We cover here the period 2007 to 2012, thus capturing the financial crisis. We then select almost 225,000 articles that contain information on individual banks. And we can identify over 1,000 unique bank names in both national and regional newspapers. So we use a list of bank names that has been provided by the Bundesbank, and so we can really search for individual bank names and also different spellings. So as you can see here, figure 1 shows all regions that are covered by our regional newspapers. So obviously the national newspapers are not included here. So we cover most of Germany with our regional newspapers. And figure 2 shows which banks are contained in our dataset. In the end, so the covered banks in the news, which are also located really quite all over from Germany. So turning to the descriptive statistics, you can see here that the regional newspapers articles are on average slightly shorter, and they also use on average slightly shorter sentences, which results in a slightly higher readability measure, indicating that articles in regional outlets are slightly easier to understand than in national outlets. So what is coverage? Coverage refers to the number of articles on events and entities, respectively. Obviously, it is important to clearly identify the target of a given article. So the biggest challenge when dealing with newspaper articles is that texts are relatively long and often contain multi-layered information. So even if the whole article deals with one topic, it may contain many different statements regarding sources, aspects, and evaluation of information. So our goal is really to extract information regarding individual banks and bank types. However, we use this broad search criteria in order to get as much or as many articles as possible. So we also catch irrelevant articles or articles that contain information on several banks. So what we do then is we define a bank statement following the literature that assumes that the content that belongs together is also located semantically close to each other. So we define a bank statement to be the sentence where the bank name occurs, together with one preceding and one succeeding sentence. So this procedure yields almost 700,000 statements, of which 400,000 are on individual banks, and almost 300,000 are statements on bank types or institutions. For our sentiment analysis, we use a dictionary-based approach. So we use a dictionary containing sentiment-bearing words in the range of -1 to 1. And then for each article or statement, depending on the analysis, we sum the polarity weights and thus receive the sentiment of a given text. So what you can see here is the average sentiment per month in articles in figure 3. I'm so sorry. We summarize them across articles, so article-based sentiment. As you can see, regional outlets evaluate banks on average less negative than national outlets, but we see a gap between them, which is due to additional information that is contained in the articles, especially in the national outlets. The articles are longer, as we have seen. But if we drop this information and really focus on statements on banks, which is shown in figure 4, we see that although the evolution of the sentiment really tracks the crisis really well, the difference between regional outlets and national outlets diminishes quite strongly. So this will be the measure that we will be working on later, so measure sentiment based on statements. We also look into bank network as is seen through the eyes of the newspapers. So what we see here is the nodes are individual banks, and the links are each time when two banks are mentioned in one article, there is a link between these two banks. And we group them using a connectivity weight in order to have bank groups or banks grouped by bank groups. So we can distinguish which bank types are connected. And we use color to indicate whether this link appears in a regional or a national newspaper. So you can see that green represents regional outlets and blue national, that in national newspapers focus more on links between other banks are like investment banks and private banks to commercial banks and also large banks, whereas regional newspapers focus more on banks that operate locally, which are savings banks and cooperative banks. So we see that obviously the news market seems to be divided into bank types, and we will look into it more closely and later on. So we look first whether newspapers bias their reports by omitting a bank type. So in the first step, we consider bank groups' monthly relative coverage in regional and national outlets. So we compare the number of statements in regional newspapers on bank type K in month T with the total number of statements in all regional newspapers in month T. And analogously, we calculate the monthly percentage of statements on each bank type in national newspapers. And as you can see, news outlets do not pay the same amount of attention to bank types. Instead, regional outlets put more weight on informing the public about savings and cooperative banks, which are highlighted in blue, whereas national newspapers rather concentrate on informing about commercial banks. But large banks and other banks are quite equally in both news sources. But so obviously news outlets do not pay the same amount of attention to all bank types. However, this does not necessarily imply that they also differ in their evaluation. So we assess this aspect by comparing the average monthly sentiment. Therefore, for each bank type K, we compare the average monthly statement sentiment in regional newspapers with the average monthly statement sentiment in national papers. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong direction. So figure 6 shows a newspaper sentiment with respect to different bank types. As you see, there is no significant difference, at least graphically, between commercial banks, large banks, and other banks in the different news sources. However, savings and cooperative banks seem to be more positively evaluated in regional outlets. So there seems to be a bias in bank sentiment, bank type sentiment. We look more specifically into the role of bank as types later on. So we consider two types of biases. We consider the bank's location geographically and also in the bank network. And then later on, we will look into bank types. The idea is that a bank that is seeking to attract more customers may opt for newspaper advertising or engage in serving as information source to outlets. However, a bank will reveal only favorable information to promote a positive perception in the public. On the other hand, the media themselves have an incentive to bias their stories to benefit advertisers. So which newspaper is of special interest to the bank and vice versa will then depend on bank's potential customers and newspapers' readership. Two different aspects of bank's location are taken into account. As I said, bank's geographical proximity to media outlet and also bank's position in the bank network. So in Germany, most firms as well as private households have a close relationship with the so-called house bank with which they transact. And usually this bank is also geographically close to its customers. Therefore, house banks are more likely to reach their customers through local newspapers. So our first hypothesis is that regional outlets evaluate closer banks more positive than national newspapers. Our test strategy will be the same throughout the next or throughout the session, so I will explain it more closely here and then skip it later on. So our dependent variable is sentiment of bank M and in outlet O. And what we are interested is the interaction term indicating here whether regional newspapers are biased towards close banks. So this will be the coefficient that we are interested in. And we use 4 different specifications. The first one without any additional effects, but then we introduce time fixed effects, bank fixed effects, outlet fixed effects, and in the last specification, we exclude banks that are only covered in regional or national newspapers. So as you can see, our first hypothesis, we have only a significant result for the first 2 specifications for a closed bank and regional outlet. But eventually, after controlling for time and bank fixed effects, we find no statistically significant differences in sentiment of closed banks compared to national outlets. This might be due to the fact that if a house bank happens to be located near to a national newspaper, it may engage in a reciprocal relationship with either a national or a regional newspaper. However, this may not apply to banks with either many branches or a business and governance model that is not geographically restricted. So we expect these banks to be more strongly connected to other banks and therefore be better characterized by high network connectivity. Which leads us to a second hypothesis that national outlets evaluate strongly connected banks more positive compared to regional newspapers. We use a very similar regression model. Now we are interested in the interaction term of a connected bank in a national outlet in order to gauge the customer proximity effect. And we define that a bank is highly connected if the logarithm of the degree is larger than 5 and 0 otherwise, obviously. So as you can see here, the effect of bank's network location on outlets bank sentiment, the indicator for a highly connected bank in national outlet is significant throughout all specifications. Turning to the role of bank type, there is a large literature showing that ideological biases can prevail in political news coverage. And there's also a theoretical model by Malahan and Schleifer that shows that ideological bias stems from news outlets' desire to slant towards readers' opposing beliefs. Outlets thereby split the news market to match readers' beliefs. In relation to German news outlets, this
You have 5
potential.
minutes left.
Thank you. In relation to German news outlets, this potentially translates into a distinction between different kinds of prevailing bank governance models in the German banking sector. Therefore, we test whether regional and national outlets slant towards different bank types. We start with the savings and cooperative banks, who serve as two pillars to the German banking sector, whereas savings banks operate under public law and cooperative banks are owned by their members. Furthermore, savings and cooperative banks have in common their regional orientation. Since savings banks work under public law, they are obliged to promoting the economic welfare of the region they're located in. And cooperative banks' main objective is promoting their members' well-being, which is obviously also a very regional focus. So banks operating with a focus on regional businesses like savings and cooperative banks will reach their customers through regional newspapers in the first place. This could be intensified by regional newspapers' pronounced focus on also covering local events. So this leads to our third hypothesis that regional newspapers view savings and cooperative banks less critical compared to national outlets, or more favorable. So again, we have the regression model where our main objective is the indicator of savings and cooperative banks and in regional outlets, which would indicate the presence of ideological bias in regional outlets towards savings and cooperative banks. As you can see in the regression results, the coefficient of interest is positive and significant throughout all specifications, showing that there is a ideological bias in regional outlets towards public banks. The third pillar is represented by private banks that are in private ownership. Among them are universal banks, commercial banks, credit banks, and we refer to them as private banks. Especially in the case of large banks, private banks operate as stockholding companies. And they act maybe interregional or internationally, and may rather reach their customers, therefore, through national newspapers. Moreover, given that regional outlets rather slant in favor of savings and cooperative banks, splitting the news market would imply that national newspapers slant towards commercial banks. We do not include here large banks because newspapers seem to view them distinctive from commercial banks. So our final hypothesis is that national newspapers evaluate commercial banks less negative compared to regional papers. Again, this coefficient captures slant towards commercial banks in national papers. And again, the coefficient of interest is significant and positive, showing that national outlets slant toward private banks across all specifications. So let me conclude. Newspapers cover a wide range of banks. Articles in regional newspapers are slightly easier to understand on average. National outlets assess banks more critically than regional newspapers on average. This is mainly driven through regional newspapers' relatively positive sentiment towards savings and cooperative banks. And finally, news outlets seem to divide the market for news depending on bank type, where regional newspapers slant towards local banks and national newspapers slant towards private banks. Overall, news can capture information on individual banks, aggregate information on bank types, and also systemic risks. As we have seen, sentiment analysis allows to measure opinions and evaluations in text, and media-based risk measures should therefore use many different news sources in order to gather information on all bank types from all regions and mitigate the effect of media bias. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Eva, for the very interesting talk. I can see few questions from Mark in the chat.
Right?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So thank you very much. So really interesting paper. So I think so I actually have 3 questions now. One is, so you pointed already out what is the difference between these regional banks in Germany and these larger banks. So and of course you indicated that these regional banks, so they are much more connected to their local whatever economy and the sort of the local society. But then I think at the same time they're also much more involved in sponsoring local events. So I don't know, maybe or maybe also local museums or these type of things, or local, I don't know, rabbit breeder exhibition. So something like this. So if there's a positive article about this, and then they just highlight that this is sponsored by a local bank, so would you take that type of thing into account? So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is, so I would think that these savings banks and cooperative banks, I would think that to a smaller extent they are involved in the typical scandals banks are involved in. So, but I think maybe simply one reason for this is that then the Landesbank, so they would basically do that. So I guess so HSH in Hamburg, of course. I guess you remember you know what. So it's simply that. So these local banks, they're sourcing this out to their sort of daughters. I think these are daughters, isn't it? So this is so maybe this simply explains why there's less negative coverage on this type of banks in the newspapers. And then the third one is the third question is that banking network. You showed this one graph. So maybe I missed it. So when you say if 2 banks are mentioned in the same article, then you say that there's a link between these 2 banks. But what if the article simply states that one type of bank is affected by something, by say a scandal or regulation, and another bank is not affected? So this then would of course mean that there's no link between these 2. Would you control for that as well? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your questions. Well, yes, the sponsorship is a thing that we checked at least manually for as many articles as we could. And it turns out that large banks and national-wide operating banks also use regional newspapers in order to promote their local engagement. So I would not say that this is in particular special for savings and cooperative banks. So I would think this is not a problem. A good point really is what you say about Landesbanks. We did not include them as savings banks. We could do that and see if something changes. Yes, so this might be interesting to look into. Well, what we did not do is a content analysis, which would capture your third point. Of course, it is possible that the article states that they are not connected. It also can be that the article only that there is only someone from the bank talking about something else, which we also would capture as information on the bank. So we can't distinguish between the 2 without conducting a content analysis or something in the way Yu Zheng did. So this is definitely a shortage of our approach. Yeah, but I can't do anything about it without conducting further analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jushan, do you want to ask a question? Jushan, I can see you have a question.
Yeah. Hi, it's very interesting talk. So yeah, I just have a question that may not be the scope of this paper, but I just wonder, I think there's a relevant question to the Q&A box as well. So what's a kind of implication of this kind of bank sentiment used outlet on real activities like for bank competition or bank around risks or other things. So I guess I'm just curious about that.
Right. Well, I think from a point of view of a bank regulator, it is really interesting to see what information is available in the news, because this is the source of information that is used by depositors. We also did a pre-study and asked them which kind of information depositors use, and they said it is mainly it's news. So I think this can be used as a early indicator for risks in the bank sector, which can be used by supervisors in the first place. So this was the idea behind the whole analysis, because our previous analysis was on market discipline, where we showed that in Germany that depositors punish banks for risky behavior, but we used bank data, so it was unclear where do they get the information from, and the idea that they probably do get it from the media, and yeah, so this is why we used this topic.
I see. Thanks.
Thanks. And I have questions from Angelica and then Anna.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay, well, thank you very much. Terrific presentation, and it was really interesting research. My question was actually very similar to the previous question, and it was around the implications, just because you did talk about systemic risk, and obviously the sentiment analysis component is multi-layered, right? First level is media, and then the second is public, as in newspaper readership influenced by the media. And yes, you had mentioned bank runs as in the context of systemic risk in the beginning of your presentation, and in your response to the question just now, of course, you were talking about risk around deposits, which of course would relate to bank runs. And so you may feel you've already answered my question, which was around implications, but it was just whether you think that public sentiment about banks has other policy implications potentially other than bank runs and depositor risk.
Right, thank you. Yeah, well, I think the kind of analysis is also really relevant also to central banks that monitor expectations in all kind of areas. And if you conduct a more deeper analysis, also content analysis, where you really establish the connections between maybe banks and other variables, that would be really interesting. But even without doing that, we have shown that only capturing the mentioning of a bank also already really tracks the evolution of the crisis really well. So, and I think this is really timely data. You can collect it like on a daily basis and then update your indicator, which I think is really fascinating to see how they evolve and how they are connected one to another.
Okay, so we have another question from Anna.
So my question is actually what you just said now about the time variation. So when you did the evaluation with the regional newspapers being nicer, more kinder to banks than the national newspapers, there was a clear gap there, but it looked the time variation or the way the sentiment moves over time was quite similar. So what you said later that it would help, to measure what's going on in the macroeconomy, it looks in that case they're very similar. Have you looked if they're indeed very similar or not?
Yes, they are. They are indeed highly correlated, but the information in the national newspapers is even more correlated to the GDP, which the regional information is less, I would say. So that it is more focused on banks, at least in the way we constructed our statement identification.
So that of course then would say to me that there is even the time variation of the local newspaper will be slightly different from the one of the national if one is more correlated with GDP to another, right?
Yes, slightly. Yes.
Is the difference
Yes.
significant? Did you do any testing or?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
Is this difference significant? Did you do any testing?
No, I didn't. It is an interesting question.
Okay, very interesting paper.
Thank you.
Yeah, by the way, for all the audience, so I just set up an unofficial host session meeting for our session because the host tell me that we have canceled the break meeting for today's conference.
Oh, we're not gonna have a break. It's because it's 10 or 15 minutes only, right?
Yeah, so yeah, people tell me that there's no official break room. So I set up an unofficial one. So everyone in the session are welcome to join us right after, maybe in 2 minutes.
Good point.
All right, thank you.
It's in the chat box. So yeah, just check the chat box.
So how do you get there then?
Oh, I just set up a Zoom meeting using my university account.
Ah, I see. Oh yeah, I see it now.
You see that? Yeah, it's in the chat box. So
yeah. Oh, nice.
Thank you. So I guess that's all questions that we have for now. If we have more questions, maybe we can join the link that Yu Chang just sent us and have more discussions over there.
Yeah, sure. So I see you there then. Thank you very much for your comments.
Great. See you.
See you.